The Call of the Bully, Chapter 22. Skull Rock. I climbed from the canoe, with Skull Rock staring down at me through the darkening sky. Just seconds before, out on the water, I had been upset about losing the lead to Todd and Magnus. Now, as I looked around at the clearing of dirt between the river and creepy woods, a different fear gripped me. I would be spending the night in a tent in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by some of my worst enemies. If the bears didn't get me, Todd would. "Hey, Josh, great paddling back there," I said, making sure to stay close by his side. Thanks," he answered. "Look." He was gazing proudly at a beetle he had just squished on a rock. Allison shook her head. "Gross. Come on, guys. Let's join the others." The three of us wandered toward the clearing. I was happy to see Survival Steve's white van parked in the back bushes next to an overgrown dirt road. Mr. Periwinkle met me. "What happened out there? You had the lead." I shrugged. My mind still couldn't make sense of how the other canoe passed us so quickly. Periwinkle looked glum. All he said was, "Your gear is leaning against the van. Set up your tent and start gathering firewood. You don't want to be out here in the dark without a tent or a fire." His tone suggested he really meant it, and I didn't wait around to be told again. For the next hour, I sat on the ground, trying to figure out the tent instructions. After finally assembling what looked like a sagging hot air balloon with poles sticking out, I headed into the woods to gather sticks and branches. I made sure not to go too far. The last thing I needed was to get lost again, like on the way up to Camp Waimea. I made several trips, and each time I returned to camp, I noticed that another canoe team had arrived. It felt better with more people there, but it was still pretty scary and getting dark real fast. The large stones and boulders at the bottom of Skull Rock formed a sinister smile that seemed to grin right at me. This was going to be a long night. I decided to head back into the forest for one final haul of firewood. This time I had to walk further in to find any. It was almost night now, and I began to feel that maybe I had wandered off too far. When a wild animal started shrieking across the river, I spun around to head back to Josh and Allison. I hadn't gotten very far when I bumped into two people, but not the two I wanted. "What have we here?" Magnus asked. "Is that you, Rathbone?" Todd demanded, peering at me through the dark. "You shouldn't be out this far all alone. Legend has it Skull Rock is cursed." I wasn't going to argue with him on that one. I tried to walk past, but he stopped me with a shove to the shoulder. "What's the rush?" He leaned in closer. This wasn't good. Todd was pumped up. Toughness no doubt coming easier with Magnus standing behind him. "Upset you're gonna lose the race?" "Like he ever hoot a chance," Magnus gloated. Todd laughed. "Come out here to cry, Rathbone." They couldn't see my face in the dark, and it was a good thing, too. I actually did feel a little teary. I was wishing I was back home in my bed instead of standing in these scary woods with two idiots. My home and even Camp Waimea seemed like a world away. Fortunately, my focus shifted from fright-inspired homesickness to the matter at hand, and knowing something awful was about to happen, and knowing my chicken-shaking knees were going to give me away, I came up with a brilliant escape plan. "Your shoes are untied." I pointed to their feet. I knew such an old and obvious trick didn't stand a chance, but I was desperate. Clunk! I was so shocked to see their two heads bang together that I almost didn't turn and run. As the echo began to fade, my feet kicked into gear, and I slipped through several bushes and dodged in and out of the trees. Magnus boomed after me. "Nice try, but you can't trick us." Under other circumstances, I might have stopped and pointed out that I had just tricked them, but I kept moving. "We'll get you later, Rathbone," Todd yelled. "Better not leave the fire and your buddy Josh." I ran straight through the woods until I emerged in the clearing. Steve was crouching over the fire ring, a few small flames dancing on the kindling. Everyone was crowded around him, No doubt the creepy surroundings were affecting them too. I joined Mr. Periwinkle, Allison, and Josh. "Look at you, Rodney," Allison said. "You look like you've just seen a ghost." "He probably did," Steve replied, cracking a branch over his knee. "Plenty of ghosts out here by Skull Rock. There was a massacre here during the French and Indian War." Mr. Periwinkle shivered more than me. "Remind me," he asked Steve, "why we have to camp here every year?" Steve smiled. "What could be better than skulls and ghosts? Now that's camping. Besides, it's accessible by dirt roads, has a nice clearing to set up tents and build a fire, is halfway between the starting point and camp, has a gentle sloping bank for the canoes." Okay, we get it," Mr. Periwinkle muttered impatiently. "Just hurry with the fire." "I reckon it's going now. Anyway, Perce, when's dinner?" "I'm not sure. Helga was taking care of the food." For the first time, I noticed Mrs. Lutescrout. She was standing beneath a dead pine tree. Seeing her face hovering in the dim light was worse than staring at Skull Rock. From her spot, she sniffed. "I'll have all of you know that Mr. Vanderdick personally offered to bring in the best steaks money can buy." Mr. Periwinkle rubbed his hands together. "I can't wait." "Well, keep waiting," Lutescrout ordered her brother-in-law. "You and most of these mob are getting franks and beans. The steaks are for today's first-place finishers." I watched Magnus and Todd emerge from the woods and high-five each other. "Awesome," Todd beamed. Then he walked right over to me and whispered, "We'll get you later." I pretended I didn't hear him and tried to keep my mind on the food situation. To be honest, I didn't share Periwinkle's disappointment. At that point, after a hard day on the water, I was real hungry, and franks and beans didn't sound bad at all. Spending the night in a tent with Josh after he ate several bowls of beans, well, that would be another matter. Half an hour later, the fire had grown large and strong, and I was glad I had gathered so much wood. My fellow campers and I had to slide back from the heat. It was a good campfire, but everyone was beginning to grumble. Vanderdick hadn't shown up yet. 30 minutes became 40. Then an hour passed, and I could hear stomachs growling in tune with the loud August bugs. He's not coming, I thought. We are out here in the middle of nowhere. Somehow hunger made the whole place more dismal and frightening. I looked off into the trees. What was lurking in there? I peered into the blackness where the river should be. Was someone or something out there watching us, ready to attack us as soon as the fire died down? I kept telling myself that as long as Steve was around, we'd be fine. "I'm starving," Tabitha moaned. Mr. Periwinkle turned back to Mrs. Lutescrout. "Well, where is he?" He should have been here ages ago." Taken by surprise, Mrs. Lutescrout appeared to shove into her mouth something that looked a lot like a chocolate bar. "Are you eating?" Mr. Periwinkle asked. "No, I just had a tickle in my throat. It's the night air." She wiped her mouth on her sleeve. "I tried calling, but there's no cell service. I'm sure he'll be here soon." "I doubt it," Steve said. "Only a crazy person would try driving that road at night. Looks like dinner's on me." He walked over to the van, reached in the back, and pulled out what looked like a bow and arrow. Josh's eyes almost popped out of his head. "Can I come with you?" Steve seemed to think it over for a moment before answering, "Sure, just keep real quiet." The two of them were heading toward the woods, below Skull Rock, when Mr. Periwinkle whimpered, "Steve, we can make it one night without food. You two better not go out there." Clearly he shared my feelings about Steve, and even Josh sticking around. Steve laughed. "No worries, Perce. These here woods are a virtual supermarket. We'll have dinner in a jiff." And in a jiff, they disappeared into the dark. Once they were gone, the woods seemed to close in on us. The night noises grew louder, and we huddled closer together. I had to pee, but there was no way I was leaving the fire. Not yet, at least. The various small conversations that were already thin and forced died. Even Tabitha stopped complaining to Todd about his father. For the past hour, she had been making nasty little comments like, "Your dad's probably still at the country club," or, "Don't those fancy cars he drives have navigation devices?" Evidently, you didn't want to be around Tabitha when she was hungry. While we humans had fallen silent, the night was far from quiet. There were the usual insect sounds, but there were also strange and chilling hooting noises. From across the river, I could still hear that animal screeching, like it was being murdered. Sometimes I thought I heard voices and laughter and crying, all shifting around in the dark. I was so hungry and tired from canoeing that I was beginning to hallucinate. I closed my eyes and imagined I heard a roaring sound like a waterfall. It was quiet at first, but it grew and grew till soon its roar was drowning out all other sounds. I opened my eyes and was shocked to see that every face around the fire was on the verge of panic. Something terrible really was out there. It sounded like 100 motors approaching. Was it a pack of maniacs with chainsaws? Lights burst down from the skull's eye sockets. Everyone screamed. Several campers ran off. I was frozen in fear. The lights grew brighter, and I could tell they were reflections from the road. At once I knew what was coming. Bikers. Steve had said only crazy people would drive out here at night. What kind of crazies were coming on motorcycles? Out of a dark dust cloud, the motorcycles rumbled past the van and into the clearing. I counted 6 grisly-looking guys on Harleys. As I got a better look at their horned helmets and bushy beards, any glimmer of hope that they were trucking in Vanderdick's dinner for a bunch of scared and hungry campers vanished. They rode around in a circle, herding us closer to the fire. The revving engines roared like savage demons, and I could barely hear the people screaming around me. One thought eclipsed all others in my mind. I should have peed when I had a chance. To her credit, the only person trying to combat the bikers was Mrs. Lutzkraut. She swatted at them with her purse, then howled, "Scotch, you ruffians!" After several minutes of chaos and terror, they parked their bikes and turned off the engines. The clouds settled and they walked toward us. One of them stepped out before the others. He was big and frightening, with a bushy orange mustache that hung down way below his chin. He frowned, rolled his head from side to side, and shouted, "What'd you think you're doing? You're on our family's land. I'm giving you 2 minutes to pack your crap and get out of here." The other 5 bikers approached us with nasty smiles and dark red eyes. "We'll do no such thing," Mrs. Lutzkraut yelled. "You boys are in big trouble. I'll have each of you arrested. Isn't that right, Percy?" A bush by the edge of the woods answered, "Let's not be rash, Helga." Ignoring the bush, one of the bikers approached Mrs. Lutzkraut. "I like my women old and feisty." He had bad teeth and an enormous belly. He gave her a wink. Mrs. Lutzkraut snapped, "How dare you? In the public schools, I've dealt with much worse than you, and I will not have—" The leader with the long orange mustache snapped his fingers in front of her face. "You ain't never dealt with the Ratsfields, lady. Your chatter is giving me a headache. One more word out of you, and I'm going to toss you in the river." While the thought of her flying into the river was oddly appealing, I was concentrating on something the biker had said. I got closer to get a better view of his face. By now, the other bikers were cracking open beer cans and yelling and laughing and scaring everyone. One of them was acting like a dog and barking at the crowd. All the while, I angled over toward the leader, who stood watching his friends with his hands on his hips and a smile curled over his teeth. Suddenly, one of the bikers grabbed a burning stick from the fire and started waving it around at the terrified campers. "Todd, can't you do something?" Tabitha whispered. Todd, who was crouching behind a shaking Magnus, had his eyes shut tight and didn't even answer. I stepped forward and in my loudest voice declared, "I'll take care of this." "Oh, thank goodness," blurted the bush. "Rodney, what could you possibly do?" Allison asked. "Be careful," Tabitha added. I didn't answer. I swung around, came up beside the leader, and bumped his elbow. He looked down at me. I watched his smile turn to a sneer. If my plan worked, I wouldn't have to worry about Todd and Magnus or anything else. If it failed, I was about to take my last breath on this planet. Before the biker could say anything, I stuck my right thumb up my nose and wiggled the rest of my fingers while waving my elbow up and down. "He's gone nuts!" Mrs. Lutzkraut exclaimed. The biker leader squinted his eyes and stared down at me. What the? How do you know? Don't you remember? I whispered. T-Bone, you taught me. His eyes focused and they seemed to soften as he recognized me. Ratbone? Holy smokes! I gotta tell the boys that the kid who took out the McThugs is right here. Even though I doubted the other campers could hear us over the crackling fire, I whispered, Wait, T-Bone, I need a favor first. Couldn't you just go along with whatever I say? He looked a bit suspicious and glanced at Lutzkraut. You ain't gonna make me kiss that old witch, are you? No, nothing that bad. Just make it like you're scared of me when I start yelling. Okay. I took a step away from him and shouted, What did you say? What did you call me? Do you know who you're dealing with? Sorry, kid, I didn't mean any disrespect. I couldn't tell who was more shocked, the biker gang or my fellow campers. Sorry won't cut it, I continued while crunching my puny knuckles. You're coming with me, and tell your little friends to stay put and behave. You're pushing it, he whispered. Then, turning to his gang, he yelled, Hang back, give us 5. We walked off about 20 feet into the dark and came out in a spot next to the river. Thanks, T-Bone. Guess I got a bit carried away. He laughed. Ratbone, we take care of our own. By the way, what you did to the McThugs was the talk of this year's Sturgis Motorcycle Rally, and I haven't heard a peep from JD and his boys in almost a year. Back in Garrettsville, where I live, I had kind of accidentally attacked a rival biker family with a beehive. It's a long story, but T-Bone had tracked me down once to thank me and made me an honorary member of his family, the Ratfields. That's when he showed me the secret handshake where you stick your thumb up your nose. So, what do you want to talk about? Well, I'm in this canoe race. That sounds cool. It isn't. I explained all about the race and Lutzkraut and Vanderdyk's plan for the property. He listened, and when I finished, he asked, They're going to cut down all my woods? I nodded. And build a Starbucks? Yes. Those are bad people. I nodded again. Well, you better win the race. We're already losing by over 4 minutes, I told him, how Todd and Magnus had passed us on the river. They went right by you? Yeah. What do they have in the boat with them? Nothing, just this girl Tabitha and a red duffel bag. What's in the bag? I don't know, but I wanted to talk to you because maybe if you ruined the race, then they wouldn't win. He looked at me. How would we do that? No, we can't ruin the race. If we did anything, that crazy lady down there would have us arrested. I must have looked disappointed, but maybe I could help you win it. Really? How? I asked. My family's been in these parts for years. Most people don't know they call it the Moonshine Canal. My great-grandpappy Ratfield dug it out with his boys back in the 20s. It's a shortcut. You see, downriver, the Drown-A-Lot winds all over the place for a spell. Moonshine Canal cuts straight through the backwoods and joins up the river after a mile. You'll save lots of time. Although no one really goes back in there anymore. Trust me, you don't want to meet up with any of them locals. Huh? Never mind that. I'll tell you how to get there. It's hidden. We talked for a couple of minutes, and he told me how to find it. Then he said, best be getting back to the others. So we good? Yeah, but could you do me one final favor? A minute later, the kids and counselors around the fire saw the head of the biker gang come charging up from the river. Boys, get on your bikes and ride! He shouted frantically. Rodney Rathbone is madder than a drunk mule and coming this way! They looked at him slightly confused. Move it or lose it! He jumped on his motorcycle. The other bikers, seeing the biggest and baddest Ratfield take off like that, must have figured something awful was approaching, for they soon dropped what they were doing, jumped on their bikes, and rumbled off. I ran out of the bushes with fists clenched, yelling, Where are they? Periwinkle emerged from his hiding spot. You scared them off. You scared them off. Good old Rodney. I ignored him. Instead, I yelled, I'm fired up. If I can't get my hands on those bikers, where's Todd and Magnus? I spotted them. Making my eyes go crazy, I walked up toward them. Ready to continue our conversation? They shook their heads and slid behind Mrs. Lutescrout. It took a few minutes for everyone to calm down. The group around the campfire was happy I had chased off the Ratfields, but they were confused and wanted to know what happened in the woods. I just shrugged and let their imaginations go to work. After a while, Todd said, "Too bad they ran away. I was about to show them." "Oh, shut up, you wimp," Tabitha scolded. "Rodney is the only brave one around here." "Yeah," Allison added, suddenly touching my arm, "and that's why we're going to win the canoe race tomorrow." Just then, Survival Steve, followed by Josh, burst into the firelight. "I got 2 possums and some wild mushrooms," he said proudly. "I'll have it all roasting in minutes. Who wants the tail? Nothing beats fresh possum tail. Did I miss anything while we were gone?" Everyone was too shocked and disgusted to answer. We just stood there watching the hair crackle off the skin of the possum as Steve fussed with the fire. We were even more shocked when he cut the rat-like tail off the thing and sucked it into his mouth like a strand of spaghetti. My appetite instantly disappeared. Steve motioned to one of the remaining piece of firewood. "Hey, Josh, throw that on the fire for me, will you?" "Sure," Josh answered, not looking up from the possum he was examining. He walked toward the wood, but came back with the red duffel bag. Before anyone could stop him, he tossed it with a thud right into the middle of the flames. Todd, Magnus, and Lutescrout all yelled, "Hey!" Todd screamed at Josh, "What did you do?" Steve told me to throw it on the fire." "What's that?" Mr. Periwinkle interrupted. The nylon bag had burned off, and we all saw a small outboard motor lying amid the red-hot embers. Engine oil spluttered out from the metal and shot bright yellow flames into the air. Mr. Periwinkle turned towards Todd. "Why do you have an engine?" "What? That's not mine." "Yes, it is," I said. The mystery of their great speed on the river had been solved. "It wasn't theirs," Mrs. Lutescrout said. "I brought it in the van just in case." While I knew she was lying, the evidence had burned up in front of me. In any event, Josh had taken care of one problem, and I hoped T-Bone's plan would take care of the rest. Mr. Periwinkle stood up. "All right, everyone. We've had enough excitement for one night, and we have another big day ahead of us tomorrow. I'm sure we'll be able to get some breakfast brought out in the morning. Right now, though, time for bed." Mr. Periwinkle was right. It had been some exciting night, but before I got into the tent, there was one unfinished piece of business that needed attention. I walked to the far side of camp, away from the glow of the fire and out into the dark. I was no longer afraid of the night. In a weird way, I felt like I had conquered it. I walked a bit further down a dead-end path that came to a stop directly below Skull Rock. As I finally took that long overdue pee, the skull seemed to be smiling right along with me. "Good try," I said, looking up at its hollow eyes. "But it takes more than a few shrieking owls and some bikers to scare off Rodney Rathbone." I thought I heard something move by my foot, and I bolted back to the tent. And that is the end of chapter 22.